Welcome everyone to today's topic on epidemiologic study designs. As researchers, our goal is to understand the world around us through systematic investigation and analysis. Quantitative research plays a crucial role in this task by allowing us to collect and analyze numerical data to uncover patterns, test hypotheses, and make informed decisions based on scientifically gathered information. In this lecture, we will explore the various types of epidemiologic study designs, each with its own unique characteristics and methodologies. These designs are essential tools in our epidemiologic research toolkit, allowing us to address different types of research questions and challenges depending on the need. Epidemiologic studies rely on proper quantitative designs to make sure they get the appropriate information from properly selected sample populations so that their conclusions can then be generalized to a broader population. In this lecture, we will focus on the three most basic study designs used in epidemiology: cross-sectional, case control, and cohort study designs. We'll begin with cross-sectional studies, which provide a snapshot of a population at a single point in time. These studies are invaluable for describing the prevalence of certain characteristics or conditions within a population. We'll then move on to case control studies, which are particularly useful for investigating rare conditions. These retrospective studies compare individuals with a condition to those without it to identify factors that may have contributed to the aforementioned condition. Our discussion will also cover cohort studies, which follow a group of individuals over time to observe outcomes. We'll differentiate between prospective cohort studies, which follow participants into the future, and retrospective cohort studies, which look back at past exposures and eventual outcomes. All three of these study designs are considered observational. Observational studies, as opposed to experimental studies, do not actively introduce an intervention to a population. They mainly record the characteristics of the study population through different data collection tools. By the end of this lecture, you will have a comprehensive understanding of these quantitative study designs, their methodologies, their applications, and of course, their limitations. Let's now present a scenario so that we can visualize the different study designs better. For most of our discussion, our sample research question is there a link between exercise and diabetes? For this research question, we can identify our two main variables: exercise and diabetes. Before we can even discuss study designs, we have to define our variables first and define them systematically. Remember, these variables are also called the population parameters or the sample statistics that we are interested in knowing. When we define variables, we have to know their conceptual definition first, or how they are understood in broader society. For instance, exercise can be defined as activities that require physical exertion, such as weightlifting, jogging, or swimming, while diabetes, on the other hand, can be conceptually defined as having abnormally high blood sugar. Then we move on to operational definitions, or how each variable is defined specifically for your research alone. One operational definition for exercise could be performing systematic workouts or strenuous physical activities for 1 hour per week or more, while diabetes can be operationally defined as having an HbA1c more than 6.5%. Operationally, a negative or no exercise can then be defined as someone who works out less than 1 hour per week, while a negative or no diabetes can then be defined as someone having an HbA1c less than 6.5%. Of course, the 1 hour per week and even the 6.5% here are all arbitrary and can be any other value, of course, within reason or acceptable defined guidelines. For instance, a different researcher can operationally define diabetes as someone with a fasting blood sugar or FBS of greater than 125 milligrams per deciliter, which is another clinical definition of diabetes. Operational definitions set a clear standardized context for your study to your readers for purposes of critique, comparison, and even replication. A 2 by 2 frequency table is a very important tool for a researcher conducting epidemiologic studies. This table places exposures and outcomes into rows and columns, respectively within our 2 by 2 table. We can then assign those with the exposure and outcome on the upper left of the 2 by 2 table, those without exposure and without outcome on the lower right, while those with exposure but without the outcome on the upper right, while those without the exposure but with the outcome on the lower left quadrant. Please practice doing your 2 by 2 tables when you do an epidemiologic study. This will help you organize not only your study population, but also your results. And this will definitely help a whole lot in your data analysis. To better understand study design in the context of variables, we need to determine which of the main variables is the exposure and which is the outcome. An exposure variable or an independent variable is a parameter that goes before the development of an outcome or a dependent variable. In our example, it is reasonable to say that our variable exercise happens prior to the variable diabetes. So we can say that exercise is the exposure or independent variable, while diabetes is the outcome or the dependent variable. I also added both the positive and negative operational definitions of both main variables here in the 2 by 2. I will leave it up to you to fill out each of the quadrants of this particular table. With that out of the way, let's proceed with the first study design. A cross-sectional study captures data from a population at a single point in time. Imagine taking a snapshot of a population. This is essentially what a cross-sectional study does. Researchers collect data from participants at one specific moment, where they usually go to a study area and collect all information on exposures or outcomes, or both, from all of the identified or recruited respondents. This is usually done using population surveys, through questionnaires, or even records review from available databases, or even through direct observation. This type of study design is classified as both observational and descriptive. The study design is often used to describe the prevalence or characteristics of a particular phenomenon within a population, since when you use this study design, you get to see how many of the study population have the specific exposure, outcome, or both, again, at a specific point in time. Technically, cross-sectional study designs can also be analytical in the sense that the population parameters, for example, one outcome and one exposure and another exposure, or one outcome and another outcome, these can all be tested for their associations with each other, or can be compared across different subpopulations. So how do you do a cross-sectional study? As with all research, defining your objectives is important, which would, of course, lead you to defining your main variables. In cross-sectional studies, determining prevalence of something, say a particular disease or exposure, or both, is a very common objective. You then define your study area and study population. Do you want to study exercise and diabetes prevalence for the entire country? Or do you want to focus on a particular city or a particular age group? Once you define your study area and population, you need to select your respondents through proper sampling methods, which are beyond the scope of this lecture. But for cross-sectional studies, probability sampling is the gold standard, since you want your samples to be representative of the entire population. When you do proper sampling, you should get samples with both exposure and outcome, samples without both exposure and outcome, samples with exposure but without outcome, and samples without exposure but with outcome. But at this point, you don't know which is which yet. Now, the last step would be to actually collect data from your sampling units or respondents. At this point, you will then know which ones have the exposures and which ones have the outcomes, and then you can plug these values into your 2 by 2 table, and then you can do your analysis. Let's go back to our scenario of determining the association between exercise and diabetes. Let's assume that we have a total of 100 respondents, randomly selected from our study population. After our survey, we were able to determine if each one has the actual exposure, which is exercise, and outcome, which is diabetes. I color-coded them here as follows. The orange icons refer to those with both the exposure and the outcome, meaning those who do exercise and who has diabetes. In this case, there are 3 of them. The green icons refer to those with the exposure but without the outcome, meaning those who do exercise but who have no diabetes. In this case, there are 15 of them. The purple icons refer to those with no exposure but with the outcome, meaning those who do not do exercise but with diabetes. And there are 7 of them. Lastly, the white icons refer to those without exposure and without the outcome, meaning those who do not do exercise and with no diabetes. In this case, there are 75 white icons. Based on these collected information, we can put the 3 orange respondents on the upper left quadrant of our 2 by 2 table, the 15 greens on the upper right, the 7 purples on the lower left, then finally, the 75 white ones on the lower right quadrant. From here, we can calculate the prevalence of the exposure, which is those who work out at least 1 hour a week, as the sum of the orange and green, or 3 plus 15, divided by the total population of 100, or 18%. We can also calculate the prevalence of the outcome, which is those with diabetes, as the sum of the orange and violet, or 3 plus 7, divided by the total population of 100, or 10%. There are still a lot of other values we can calculate just from the 2 by 2 table alone, which are beyond the scope of this lecture. Please remember the color coding convention, as we will use this across the other study designs. Cross-sectional studies are simpler, resulting in being cheaper and quicker to conduct. It can look at multiple variables, whether exposures, outcomes, or both. And since you only do one data collection and you don't do follow-ups, it is not prone to dropouts. However, its disadvantages include its poor contribution to causality, since you only do one data collection for both exposure or outcome. Therefore, you cannot justify whether the exposure actually preceded your outcome. Another drawback is its inaccuracy for rare conditions, since sampling of big populations may miss out on subjects with rare disease. Now let's move on to the next study design. Case control study design is the most misunderstood observational study design and is usually confused with retrospective cohort studies. Case control study designs assume some time between an exposure and an outcome, and thus have some form of time element in contrast to cross-sectional studies. In contrast to cohort studies, observation of both exposures and outcomes is only done at a single point in time. Data collection of the exposures, however, is done retrospectively, meaning subjects are selected at present, but we review their past records to see if they have had the exposures in the past. Thus, the retrospective direction of inquiry starts at present, then reviews the past. So how do you do a case control study? Again, defining your objectives is important, which would of course lead you to defining your main variables. In case control studies, you absolutely need to define both exposure and outcome variables. The most common measured parameter in a case control study is the odds ratio. Case control studies are mainly used to study rare outcomes. For our case control purposes, our outcome variable can be the hypothetical rare condition of superdiabetes. Then we can retain our exposure variable of exercise, and we want to study the relationship between exercise and superdiabetes. Next, you then define your study area and study population, but only broadly. Since case control studies are often used to study rare outcomes, the study population is often more contained. Usually, the study population are people with a rare condition of interest and those near them, in this case, those with superdiabetes and the people around them. After you define your study area and population, you need to select both your cases and controls, hence the name Case Control Study Design. Cases are defined as respondents with the outcome. Take note, to be able to select cases, you need to already know people with the outcome of interest. In our case, those with superdiabetes. Controls are defined as respondents without the outcome of interest. You usually recruit controls with some sort of case matching, meaning the characteristics of your controls generally are the same as the characteristics of your cases, except for the presence or absence of the outcome. At this stage, you still don't know whether your cases or controls have the exposure. The next step is to then go back in time, that is, to review their old records to see if both cases and controls actually had the exposure. In this case, did they exercise for at least 1 hour a week before the outcome was recorded at present? At this point, you will know which samples have the exposures and outcomes. Then you can do your analysis. When we do case controls, it is assumed that we don't sample the entire population. We only purposively get a small number of cases, then look for an equal number of controls from the rest of the population. This is the process of recruitment. In our scenario, let's assume that we already know all 10 persons with superdiabetes or who are positive for the outcome from our 100-person overall population. We then assign all of them as cases. Remember that both the orange and purple icons represent those with diabetes, but at this point, we don't know yet if these people had the exposure of doing exercise in the past. We then select 10 persons from the rest of the population without diabetes, the white and the green ones, and then assign them as controls. Again, at this point, we don't know who among this group have had the exposure in the past. When we do our data collection, we then retrospectively look at the medical records of our cases, and then for our example here, we finally see that 3 of them have had the exposure, while 7 did not. We also review the records of the control group and eventually find that 2 of them had the exposure, while 8 did not. Given these findings, how do you think the 2x2 table will look like? I will leave it up to you to construct the 2x2 table for this particular example, for this particular study design. As a hint, it will not be the same as the previous 2x2 table from the cross-sectional study design. But as another hint, the 2x2 table is quite obvious from what is shown on screen. From these observed data, we can then calculate the odds ratio. This will be discussed more in the data analysis lectures. The strength of case control studies lies in its ability to study rare outcomes, since active case finding is used to identify the cases, which is one of the initial steps of a case control study design. Case control studies are also useful for diseases with long latency periods between exposure and outcome, since you often only use old records to look for exposures. Case control studies can also be used for multiple exposures. The main disadvantage of case control studies is that you only can study one outcome at a time, and that outcome defines who your cases are. Since you often study rare conditions, your design is also prone to selection bias. Another disadvantage is the added complexity of doing matching, since you need to look for respondents very similar to your cases. Now, let's proceed to the third study design. Prospective cohort studies start at the present, then follows the cohort into the future to see if they develop the outcome. Follow-up data collection can occur once, but can also be done multiple times. Similar to case control studies, cohort studies also incorporate the concept of time between exposure and outcome. Similar to case control studies, the element of time between exposure and outcome is a crucial characteristic of cohort studies. Again, exposures occur prior to outcomes. So how do you do a prospective cohort study? Again, defining your objectives is important, which would of course lead you to defining your main variables. In cohort studies, you absolutely need to define both exposure and outcome variables. The most common measured parameters in a cohort study is the relative risk or incidence rates. For our cohort study purposes, our outcome variable can be our original outcome, which is diabetes. Then we can also retain our exposure variable, which is exercise. Next, we then define our study area and study population. Compared to case control studies, we select a population where we already know the presence of exposures rather than outcomes. After we defined our study area and population, we need to select both cohort and controls. Hence the name cohort study design. The cohort group or internal controls are defined as respondents with the exposure. Take note, to be able to select cohorts, you need to already know people with the exposure of interest. In our case, those who do exercise, or defined as those who work out at least 1 hour per week. The control group or external controls are defined as respondents without the exposure of interest. Similar to a case control design, you usually recruit controls with some sort of matching, meaning the characteristics of your controls generally are the same as the characteristics of your cohort group, this time except for the presence or absence of the exposure. At this stage, you still don't know whether your cohorts or controls have the outcome. The next step is to wait into a predetermined amount of time in the future to see if both cohorts and controls actually develop the outcome. In this case, did they develop diabetes in the future? At this point, after follow-up, you will know which of the sample units have the exposures and the outcomes, and then you can do your analysis. Similar with case control studies, when we do cohort studies, it is assumed that we don't sample the entire population. During our recruitment process, we only get a small sample of internal controls or cohort group, then look for an equal number of external controls or the control group. In our scenario, let's assume that our sample size calculation needs 10 samples for the cohort group, which is the group who are doing exercise, which are the orange plus the green icons. Some of them will have diabetes in the future, but at this point in time, we don't know which ones yet. We also get 10 samples for the control group, which are people who are not doing exercise, as we've defined it, which in this case are the white and purple icons. Again, some people in this group will eventually have diabetes in the future, but again, at this point, we still do not know. Let's say for our study, we wanted to check if our two groups develop diabetes after 5 years. So during our data collection phase at the 5-year mark after our recruitment, we call our participants back and observe that 2 from our cohort group and only 1 from our control group developed diabetes, while the rest did not. Given these findings, how do you think the 2 by 2 table will look like? Again, I will leave it up to you to construct the 2 by 2 table for this particular example for this particular study design. From these observed data, we can then calculate the relative risk and incidence rates. This will be discussed more in your data analysis lectures. Since cohort studies involve sample selection of exposure before the onset of the outcome, cohort studies have stronger contribution to causality compared to the other study designs in our list. It can also investigate multiple exposures, outcomes, and even confounders. The main disadvantage of prospective cohorts is the potential for dropouts. Since you follow the groups across time, some members of either group can be lost to follow up, whether they die or they just fail to show up during the follow-up. Rare outcomes or outcomes with a long latency period can also skew your results. Lastly, cohort studies are often more expensive since you need to conduct multiple data collection stages. Let's now discuss quickly prospective cohorts twin, the retrospective cohort study design. The general steps and flowchart of a retrospective study design is very similar to that of a prospective cohort with subtle differences. For one, instead of selecting cohorts and controls based on their exposure status at present, you select them using their exposure status in the past. You do this by looking at their past records. First, you look for records with the exposure of interest, then assign these in the cohort group. Next, you look for records with similar characteristics as the cohort group but without the exposure of interest, then assign them as the control group. Again, at this stage, you should not yet know whether any of your samples develop the outcome. The next step is to comb through the records into a predetermined time after the exposure to see if both cohorts and controls actually develop the outcome. In this case, did they eventually develop the outcome also from their records, but after their exposure? At this point, you will know which of the sample units have the exposures and the outcomes, then you can do your analysis. Retrospective cohort studies are quicker and less expensive to do than prospective cohort studies, since you only do records review. Similar to prospective cohorts, it can also look into multiple exposures, outcomes, and confounders. The main disadvantage of this study design is its propensity to rely on proper record keeping by other people. And due to its records review nature, misclassification is also an issue, and you cannot simply ask the questions if you have any questions. Remember, you're only looking at records, and you do not have access to the actual people. As a quick side note, there is this thing called a serial cross-sectional study design, the figure on your left. A serial cross-sectional study involves conducting multiple cross-sectional studies over different time points. This design allows researchers to observe changes and trends in a population over a period of time, even though each data collection point involves different individuals. It's like taking multiple snapshots at different times to see how things change. For example, we may want to investigate trends in the prevalence of diabetes for a specific study population. We can conduct multiple cross-sectional studies and collect data through surveys to get the prevalence of diabetes every 5 years, and then compare the data across different time points to identify the trends and possible changes. This example involves different sets of respondents for each cross-sectional survey instead of following the same set of people every 5 years. This study design looks somewhat familiar with the prospective cohort study design, the figure on your right. So let me ask you this question. How is a serial cross-sectional study design different from a prospective cohort study? I leave it up to you, but you can put your answers in the comments below. And that's it. I hope now you are able to differentiate the three main epidemiologic study design in terms of their main uses, their advantages and disadvantages, and how they are conducted in the field. I hope you can also design your own cross-sectional, case control, and both cohort studies according to your study objectives and operational variables.